who is widely regarded as a hero but was actually a terrible person. A bit of an odd one, but Coco Chanel, not a hero in the traditional sense, but in fashion history, she was a massive pioneer in bringing more comfortable and less restrictive designs to women. She saw and participated in the change from women having to wear corsets and gowns to being able to wear pants and work clothing, which was a massive thing for feminism. However, she was quite literally a socialist. So the most comfortable thing a woman can wear is a trouser suit, but only if it's sewn by workers for the glory of the state. Story 2. Tom Cruise. 5 minutes of Googling about him and his church will give you shivers. And people praise him for being a great film star who does all his own stunts. He does his own stunts because he thinks space aliens have given him superpowers. A lot of people are saying that A, Scientology is no more weird than other religions, and B, having weird beliefs doesn't make you bad. Scientology is the only religion that has their scriptures behind a paywall, and as for Cruise, he doesn't allow Nicole Kidman to see their children because she left the church. Katie Holmes had to do a midnight run with their daughter knowing that was the only way she could leave the church and still be allowed contact with their child. Cruise's wedding and his house are staffed by indentured church members who aren't paid and can't leave. His best man is Scientology's Pope, David Miscavige. Miscavige's wife, Shelley, has not been seen in public for many years and is believed to be held captive against her will. Cruise is second in command and chief salesman for a religion that regularly separates members from their families and their wallets. Story 3. Sorry, but John Lennon was a real piece of crap. He wrote Working Class Hero while owning an entire apartment to keep his furs at the perfect temperature. He decried being abandoned by his parents while turning around and doing the same thing to Julian. He was claiming to be a house husband while Sean had a full-time nanny. Even Sean admitted he screamed into his ear so loudly while angry it broke his eardrum. He turned George against Paul. He had affairs on both wives. I could go on for hours. I do love his music, though. Story 4. Andrew Jackson. But what do? We put Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill, the man who ethnically cleansed the southeastern U.S., the Trail of Tears. A man who didn't just own slaves, but bought and sold them as a business. In short, he was the Netanyahu of his day. This is not a man that should be honored, he should be shunned. And don't use the excuse that, well, that's what the times were like. That is a lame argument. There's no pain that a 19th century oligarch felt that was any worse than the suffering endured by anyone at the hands of slavery. Story 5. General George S. Patton is often praised for his military success, but his record shows serious flaws that undermine his status as a hero. He was known for his arrogance, cruelty, and lack of respect for the soldiers under his command. Patton harmed wounded soldiers suffering from shell shock, calling them cowards, and his obsession with personal glory often put lives at unnecessary risk. His open admiration for authoritarianism and his racist anti-Semitic remarks further reveal a man whose character falls far short of heroic. Story 6. Want to get really controversial? Churchill. Sure, he is a World War II hero in the West, but if you look at what he did in India, he was basically a villain. The Bengal famine of 1943 ended anywhere between 2 and 3 million people, and it wasn't a natural disaster. It should be called forced starvation. British policies under Churchill directly resulted in the casualties. Grain exports kept going out from India, boats that could have moved food were seized under his denial policy, and requests for relief from India were ignored because ships were being used for Europe. Anyway, most heroes from the West during the colonial period don't hold up to scrutiny when you look at what they did in the colonies, and Churchill is up there in that list. Story 7. Every one of the defenders of the Alamo, since the whole reason they were there was to defend the right of Texans to own human beings. Texas was a part of Mexico, and Mexico just achieved independence from Spain, and the first thing they did was declare slavery illegal. But Texas was not happy with that, so they immediately rebelled so they could keep their slaves, and a whole bunch of white volunteers showed up to help keep black people in chains. The hero of the Alamo was General Santa Anna. Story 8. John McCain. His first wife stayed loyal during his entire stay in North Vietnam but got kind of disfigured in a car accident. He came home and wanted to start moving into politics because he would never be an admiral like his father and grandfather. So he promptly started cheating on his wife with a hot rich chick who was heir to the Hensley Company, which is a major Anheuser-Busch distributor, and was able to bankroll his political career. He then fought against the expansion of veterans' benefits during the Iraq War to not hurt retention. Then when the Dems took over Congress, he skipped the vote on the expansion, including the post-9/11 bill, which Bush ended up signing to not hurt him against Obama, who had voted for it. During the worst of OIF, when the U.S. was losing and the Iraq Civil War was at its worst, He also pushed a narrative of things getting better that was a flat out lie. Dude had guts for not accepting release but treated his family and other vets like pawns. Story 9. I say this as a huge lifelong fan of the Foo Fighters, but honestly, Dave Grohl? I'm not sure it is fair to call him a terrible person, or a hero really, but he often gets held up as some kind of golden boy rocker who is just endlessly wholesome when in reality he has had numerous scandals related to infidelity. He has had some publicists do some real work on his image. Grohl is certainly no P. Diddy, he's just a dude who struggles with the same stuff a lot of people do. I just think he gets whitewashed a lot. I also don't think his flaws are so severe that it requires separating his art from him. In fact, I think understanding him as a human being helps to place each of the Foo Fighters' albums in a much more deeper emotional context. Story 10. People don't like this one. George Floyd. What happened to him was objectively wrong and tragic, which is why he became the face of a movement. But the guy was a bad dude. A lifelong petty thief and occasional substance dealer, he once dressed up as a repairman and robbed a pregnant woman at gunpoint, pointing the loaded gun at her belly. He got arrested while on substances as confirmed by the autopsy. I don't think he needed to be a good guy to make him the face of the movement, but people assume he was because we need to make people to be heroes or villains. Bad guy who bad thing happened to isn't black and white enough for us. Story 11. I'm gonna go out on a limb here, probably doesn't fit the thread, I don't know, because he wasn't hailed a hero specifically, nor a terrible person either, but Michael Jackson, he's still very widely regarded as innocent and the king of pop, which he still is the king of pop and all, but that doesn't erase his sins, which, again, I digress, they're hard to call sins. I think he was just disturbed and needed help, but no one even acknowledged he had a problem to help him in the first place. So I don't blame him or want to imply he's terrible, but 100% he's not the saint anyone thinks he was. He definitely did terrible things. Sorry, as a 30-year-old man who still sees him widely regarded as innocent, I just can't. There is an undeniable interview in my opinion if you watch it that shows how he was in public, so I can't imagine in private. Story 12. Depending where you stand in history, Richard Nixon, who as a presidential candidate in 1968, is widely believed to have sabotaged Vietnam peace talks for political gain. Interference with peace talks. In 1968, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson was working to secure a peace deal in Vietnam before the presidential election. Fearing that a peace deal would help his opponent Hubert Humphrey, Nixon used a back channel led by Republican fundraiser Anna Chennault to urge South Vietnamese leaders to boycott the talks. Chennault passed on Nixon's message that if he were elected, South Vietnam would receive a better deal than the one being offered by the Johnson administration. President Johnson and his administration were aware of the back-channel communication through FBI surveillance but chose not to reveal the information publicly. The South Vietnamese followed Nixon's advice and withdrew from the Paris negotiations just days before the election. Nixon won the 1968 election by a narrow margin and, once in office, escalated the war, delayed peace, and cost. After his election, Nixon escalated the war into Laos and Cambodia, and a peace deal was not reached until 1973. The war dragged on for 5 more years with thousands of additional American lives lost, along with many more Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian casualties. When a peace agreement was finally reached, it was essentially the same one that had been on the table in 1968. Story 13. Our historical narrative often transforms complex human beings into flawless monuments, a process that does a disservice to both history and ourselves. We conveniently overlook the profound moral failings that were intertwined with the virtues of our most celebrated figures. Mahatma Gandhi is revered as a paragon of nonviolence, yet his legacy is shadowed by allegations of racism and troubling relationships with young women. Martin Luther King Jr., the moral voice of the civil rights movement, is documented to have engaged in personal conduct that stands in stark contrast to his public principles. Even George Washington, the archetype of the reluctant leader, actively cultivated his image, appearing at the Constitutional Convention in his military uniform to command authority and shape his legacy. This act of myth-making serves a profound psychological purpose. By elevating these individuals to the status of unimpeachable heroes, we subtly remove the burden of expectation from our own shoulders. We create a narrative of exceptionalism. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world. He was Martin Luther King. Now, this implies that world-changing action is the exclusive domain of a rare, almost superhuman breed of person. In reality, he, like all who came before and after him, was a profoundly human and complicated individual, a normal, messed-up person, not unlike you or me. This reframing leads to an inevitable and challenging question. If world-changing action is not the product of perfection but of fallible humanity, then what excuse remains for our own inaction? If they were merely people, flawed as we are, then why have we not done more? Story 14. No one has said Isaac Newton yet, so I will. He was an absolute genius, probably one of, if not the greatest physicist, and also one of, if not the greatest mathematician to ever live in one breath. He basically invented the math necessary to invent physics all by himself, then invented Newtonian mechanics, gravitational law, and also contributed to solving many mathematical problems. Bernoulli once submitted an open problem to the mathematics community that he had spent weeks trying to solve. Eventually, they translated it to English and sent it to Newton after no one successfully solved it, only for Newton to solve it in one afternoon. Bernoulli's solution was more elegant, but the right answer is the right answer. And oh boy, was Newton a terrible person. He only published his work on calculus after Leibniz did so because he didn't want Leibniz to have the credit. Otherwise, he would have kept it to himself. He had all the paintings of Robert Hooke burned. Newton had a lot of power at this point, so could do this. To this day, we have no paintings of Hooke. A book on Newton, Dark Side of Newton, also claims he threatened to burn his parents' house down, use counterfeit money. The guy was treasurer of the Royal Mint. He was loaded. Story 15. I feel like the most obvious one is Christopher Columbus, somehow still celebrated by around half of the United States. He is said to be the person who, quote-unquote, discovered the United States, even though around 50 to 60 million people already live there. He actually enslaved many of the natives, which he called Indians, which we called them until around the Civil Rights era, 1960s to 70s for non-Americans. And not only that, he treated them horribly. He was known as brutal towards them. He brought smallpox, measles, influenza, and a few other diseases to America, ending about 230,000 people in only about 25 years. I feel like I could go on for pages, so I'll just leave it here. Story 16. How has no one mentioned Marvin Heemeyer, aka the Killdozer guy? So many people have practically canonized the guy for being a reasonable person, forced to do an unreasonable thing. But the dude was nothing but a greedy schmuck. Dude bought some land for $42,000 that used a buried cement mixer as a makeshift septic tank. Obviously, this wasn't up to any sort of code, so the city gave him the option of either hooking up to the city sewer line or putting in a proper septic tank. His response was that the government should be paying for him to get a sewage hookup. He then opened a muffler repair shop on the land. Years later, a concrete company was buying up the surrounding land to build a new plant, and Heemeyer initially asked $250,000 for the lot. Then he said he had it reappraised and upped his asking price to $375,000. The concrete company offered him $350,000, but then he came back and said he had it reappraised and now wanted $450,000 for the lot. The concrete company understandably told him to screw off, diplomatically of course, and decided they would just build around him. Heemeyer then filed a lawsuit and tried to get the EPA to block construction. The concrete company offered to let him hook up to their sewage line for free if he dropped the lawsuit, which he refused. Around this time, the buried cement truck finally filled up. Heemeyer decided the best course of action was to start pumping it out into an irrigation ditch next to the property. When that didn't work, he tried to illegally hook up to a neighboring sewage line, but he got busted doing it. At this point, it had been 9 years since he bought the property and was legally required to have proper waste management. All this time, the city had not been enforcing code or levying fines against him, but this was apparently the last straw for them. They finally decided to fine him a grand total of $2,500 for everything. Eventually, his lawsuit was dismissed and the concrete plant could get started. He then bought what would become the Killdozer for $16,000 and had it shipped over 1,000 miles from California. Initially, he had just put it on his property and let it sit with a for sale sign, which obviously no one went for. A few months after that, he closed the muffler business and tried to sell off everything. The bulldozer still didn't sell, so he took that as a sign from God to use it as the tool of his vengeance. He finally sold off the property itself for $400,000 with the agreement that he would lease part of the building from the new owners to quote-unquote finish his work. Within a day of the new owners taking over, they had it hooked up properly to the city's sewer system. His work, of course, being the refit of the bulldozer into the Killdozer. He even started living in the building illegally so he could dedicate as much time as possible to refitting it. Now, these refits included makeshift armor, shielded cameras so he could see where he was going, gun ports for 3 rifles, a 50, a 308, and 22 caliber, AC, and a week's worth of food and water. Ironically, despite it getting the nickname Killdozer, Heemeyer failed to end or even injure a single person during his 2-hour hissy fit. It did damage a few buildings, causing approximately $7 million in damages, and attempted to detonate 30,000 gallons of propane with his guns, which thankfully didn't work. One of the buildings he drove into had a basement which the dozer got stuck in, and so he ended it all before police could get him. Story 17. Literally, Mother Teresa. Sure, she offered medical care in a time where neglect was the norm, but her inner darkness led her to keep patients on the brink of suffering in order to deepen their connect with the divine. It seems like to her, God's little saint who could do no wrong, his silence meant that she was tribulated enough. She would use the donations from dictators to give herself top-notch care and force young mothers to give birth in filth without medicine, even if it meant their demise. Controversial as, again, limited funds usually meant no medical care, but this is a classic case of holier than thou that we can look back upon and say, different times, same darkness. Story 18. Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart of England. In popular culture, he's seen as a brave warrior king, an English hero. But historical records show us that although he was a good warrior, he was a cruel governor to his people that only spent 6 months in England during his 10-year rule. His marriage was so dysfunctional that even the Pope called him out on it, and he was known contemporaneously as O Sinon, which means yes and no in Occitan, alluding to how difficult he was. During the Crusades, which is why he's famous, he emptied the kingdom's coffers to fund his campaigns and quarreled endlessly with other rulers. Although he won victories during this period, the crusade failed to retake Jerusalem, and he managed to get himself captured, imprisoned, and then ransomed for a huge sum on the way back. Story 19. The MCU Captain America. He was a self-righteous bud and a total schmuck to Tony for no reason. He challenged Tony to a fight almost right off the bat. He knew Bucky ended Tony's parents. Tony moved on with his life after the snap and had a daughter with Pepper. It was Captain America who convinced him to time travel to bring everyone back. In the end, for the big game that Steve spoke of, it ended up being Tony who sacrificed himself while Steve got to go back and marry Peggy after sleeping with her niece and relive his whole life over again. Hell, he even got a Broadway show based on himself. Story 20. Can we say Charlie Kirk? He's being praised as a martyr whose only crime was debating college students on conservative values, but in truth, he has never done such a thing in good faith. He would debate people using gotcha moments with people 10 years his junior, and share viral clips of it online using bad faith tactics like the Moat and Bailey fallacy. He, along with other online vloggers, has been instrumental in helping elect Trump for a second term, which has resulted in the loss of termination protections, a trade war on the entire planet, immigration enforcement actions in the streets of major blue cities, factories shutting down to no workers, damaged relations with South Korea when their factory was raided, the loss of billions in revenue and tourism from Canada and others, the loss of all soybean exports to China, the first real threat of stagflation since the 1980s, legal attacks on DEI, trans people, and women in the military, emboldened the current White House to amplify partisan rhetoric with continuous calls for aggressive political action, and maybe the eventual strains on democratic norms in the USA. He is already joking about running for a third term and calling for the arrest of governors he doesn't like. His organization wasn't some grassroots movement. It was funded by right-wing billionaires with an operating cost of $80 million per year. Story 21. Jimmy Savile. He was one of the biggest celebrities of all time in Britain. You see him in TV shows, talk shows, hear him on the radio, and even see him in the odd music video. But after his passing, he was exposed for having committed widespread essay. He used his fame and position to gain access to vulnerable individuals, particularly in hospitals, and this went on for decades. The worst part, it was an open secret for decades. Many of his victims came forward as early as the 80s, reported him to the police, and got dismissed for inventing stories and being hysterical. The BBC was also informed about his behavior and did absolutely nothing. Some victims even faced reputational damage in the media, which ruined their lives for daring to speak out against him. It's an incredibly bleak and horrifying thing to learn about, and what the worst part was is that British society learned absolutely nothing from it either. Story 22. George Washington wasn't great. Though he was critical of slavery, Washington continued to use enslaved labor during his presidency. When the national capital moved to Philadelphia in 1790, Washington realized that the 8 enslaved workers in his presidential household might take advantage of Pennsylvania's emancipation law, which allowed the enslaved people of visitors to claim their freedom after 6 months' residence in the state. Washington was especially concerned because most of the household's enslaved staff were owned by the Custis estate. If they escaped, Washington would have to reimburse the value of the lost quote-unquote property. To evade the statute, Washington sent the enslaved cook, waiters, and maids out of his estate every 6 months, instructing his secretary to move the enslaved people in a way that will deceive both them and the public. Story 23. Thomas Edison. A lot of his inventions were invented by his workers, and he had a reputation for exploiting them. Most of the time, he took the patent and the credit for their work. He and his company aggressively undermined Nikola Tesla after Tesla designed AC. Unlike Edison, Tesla didn't try and profit as directly from his work, he just aimed to fund his experiments. I believe he also conducted a film demonstration of an electrocution. If you're enjoying the video so far and learning a thing or two, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 24. Christopher Columbus. I'm sorry, he wins, hands down, one of the greatest villains in all of history, yet he is regarded as a hero, taught in history classes as being a brave explorer, utter and complete BS. He was so obsessed with finding gold that he committed terrible atrocities. Once quelled, each native had to give him a certain amount of gold, which would earn them a token to wear around their neck, signifying they paid the gold they owed. And of course, all the European diseases they brought over ended millions of people. The estimate over 50 years of occupation ended around 3 to 5 million people. Oh yeah, and a side effect of Columbus extracting all this gold and flooding the market caused a collapse of the gold market in Africa, which caused the Europeans there to switch to trading people in order to make a profit. In a very real sense, Columbus was the father of the African slave trade, which would continue for hundreds of years. We all know how that went. He was so bad that even the ruthless Spanish tried him for crimes against humanity. So yeah, Christopher Columbus, monster, tarted up to be a hero in the worst sort of way. Story 25. John McCain, a Nepo baby through and through, had no business being a naval aviator. He put his own well-being ahead of his fellow POWs by announcing how important his father and grandfather were almost immediately upon being captured. He routinely used naval resources to help cheat on his wife once he met someone with more money and access to power. He had access to those resources because he used his family connections to land a gig schmoozing with DC types after his post-Vietnam press blitz. Plus, he was a lifelong Republican, and we all know what they're like. But he did ask that one lady to stop being openly racist at his press event. I guess that counts for something. Story 26. Thomas Jefferson. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, one of the most beautiful and influential pieces of political literature in human history. He openly advocated for the abolishment of slavery to the extent of originally including a paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, chastising the practice of slavery and calling for its abolition, which he only removed after counsel from other founding fathers. He supported the French Revolution for the people of France and thought America should have joined the cause. He was responsible for the Religious Freedom Clause in the Virginia State Constitution, which was pretty radical at that time. He was against the federal bank, concerned about Americans and the government becoming beholden to a financial system and potential corruption. He advocated for America to remain an agrarian nation rather than commerce-focused. He completed the Louisiana Purchase, basically doubling the size of the U.S. for peanuts, but he was a slave owner, a major one. On his last breath, he declined giving all his enslaved people their freedom, which was a somewhat common practice of the day. Story 27. I'd say Obama, first black president, eloquent, presidential. They gave him a Nobel Prize, ha ha ha. Then he started 3 more conflicts in the Middle East. He oversaw the intervention in Libya that led to the removal of Muammar Gaddafi and resulted in ongoing instability. This instability has contributed to severe problems, including reports of exploitation in the capital city. He also oversaw operations in Syria. Militant groups now control portions of that place. Yemen is torn up. There were widespread drone strikes, and that's a Nobel Prize winner right there. And that's not all. He also made difficult choices regarding Americans. He bailed out his banking buddies to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of billions, all the while doing nothing for 5 million families getting kicked out of their homes. But the Wall Street guys got their million-dollar bonuses. I read that his cabinet was handpicked by Wall Street bankers, and he didn't resist at all. Now, as a reward for his political service, they pay him $500,000 per appearance to do speeches at their country clubs. Must be nice to have a 49-acre estate on Martha's Vineyard. Oh, I almost forgot his trip to Flint, Michigan, where he made misleading statements about the safe, clean water there. Story 28. Mother Teresa of Calcutta. If you actually travel to Calcutta and ask about her, people are at best indifferent to her work and at worst furious at how she managed her clinics. Her clinics had no trained nurses, inadequate equipment, and they were often poorly equipped to help the sick or poor. She even stated publicly that her focus was not primarily on alleviating suffering, but on encouraging people toward faith through their suffering, suggesting that suffering could deepen a connection with the divine. The Red Cross reportedly tried to intervene multiple times, but she was raising substantial funds for the Catholic Church. She raised billions for the church, but her clinics consistently operated with poor conditions, which were described as run down and were sometimes criticized for, well, potentially contributing to the spread of disease rather than alleviating it. Imagine going into a Catholic church facility in Calcutta in the 90s because you got leprosy and there are rumors of a woman who can help. They give you a bed, still wet from the person before. The nuns gently wash you down, talk about faith for hours on end, and let you sleep. Then they wake you up trying to get you to sign up for the newsletter, join their church, and tell you to leave after giving you an injection of medicine. 3 months later, you get some other disease like syphilis or hepatitis from that injection. Meanwhile, the woman who ran that clinic gets to dine with world leaders. Story 29. I was on a flight once where Tug McGraw was sitting in the row in front of me. Tug is revered here in Philadelphia. Sitting behind me was a boy who looked about 8 years old and was trying to work up the nerve to ask him for his autograph. Finally, the kid with his father went up to his seat and asked him, and Tug said no, and rather rudely at that. The kid was crushed, and I'm probably the only person in Philadelphia who thinks Tug McGraw is a piece of crap. Story 30. Che Guevara lived for armed revolutionary struggle and sought to spread Marxist revolutions across countries, regardless of national borders. He thought violent guerrilla warfare was necessary everywhere. Here's a summary of where he directly led or participated in armed insurgency. Cuba, 1956 to 1959, fought alongside Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution to overthrow Batista. After victory, he oversaw the sentencing of enemies and managed parts of the new regime. The Congo, 1965, attempted to aid Marxist rebels fighting the government. The mission failed due to poor organization and a lack of local support. Bolivia, 1966 to 1967, tried to spark a peasant revolution similar to Cuba's, which ended with his capture and execution. Story 31. The list is long because people are complicated. The good doesn't make up for the bad in their actual lives. However, remembering the good is a good example to others. There's no point in truth-telling because the point is to have a good example, a role model, a hero. People are stolen for that purpose and always have been. It doesn't really matter whether George Floyd was a good or bad man. He was stolen by the zeitgeist to represent a movement, a just cause. He's iconic now. Charlie Kirk is exactly the same. JFK, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, good or bad, they get distilled down to a single idea, concentrated, and that's it. This leads to interesting weirdness when people meet favorite comedians who aren't funny or sulky actors. Finding out stuff can be traumatic too. Can you enjoy Michael Jackson's music knowing the truth? What about Wagner? I know people who can't watch Will Smith since The Slap. In the UK, Jimmy Savile raised record-breaking amounts of money for charity and devoted most of his life to his works, but now he's a demon. Mother Teresa also devoted her life to good works. However, she was known to have a harsh approach. Now she's a saint. The truth can't really work because everyone is taken as doing good and bad, but we need heroes and villains to give us focus. Story 32. Honestly, I'd say Peacemaker. People see him as this hero now because of the show, but in the movie, he literally ended Rick Flag, a guy who was genuinely trying to do the right thing. The flag stood for honor and loyalty, and the Peacemaker took him out just to protect a cover-up. That's not hero behavior, that's straight-up villainy. The crazy part is that now he's the star of his own series with 2 seasons and everyone cheers for him. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoy the show, it's hilarious and well-made, but it's wild how quick we are to label someone like that a hero. Story 33. Laura Ingalls from the TV series. My parents would ask us kids why we couldn't be more like the Ingalls' kids from the TV show. I just watched the entire series as an adult. Laura committed actions I never would have considered. She terminated her father, she stole money from the church to invest in a money-making venture to benefit herself. She pushed Nellie in a wheelchair down a steep hill into a stream. Even though Nellie was faking her leg injury, it still was a dangerous stunt. There may have been more questionable actions she took, but these are the ones I remember. She was no better than Nellie. In fact, her I'm better than you attitude towards Nellie frustrated me. Nellie had a difficult and unpleasant mother, so she wasn't taught good behavior. Unlike Laura, who had 2 loving, caring parents who taught her how to be a good person, Laura has no excuse except for being human and a kid. Story 34. Obama is widely regarded as a hero, at least among liberals, but he, like pretty much any US president, had significant ethical failings. He authorized more drone strikes than all previous presidents combined, including signature strikes which terminated people without even confirming their identity, based solely on behavioral patterns. He also claimed the right to terminate American citizens extrajudicially and did so on several occasions, all based solely on executive authority with no input from Congress, the judiciary, etc. Then there were the NSA leaks that Snowden exposed about how state surveillance was hugely expanded by Obama. The administration also prosecuted more whistleblowers than every other president combined. This included pursuing journalists, including Chelsea Manning, who exposed confidential military information, and John Kiriakou, who exposed CIA detention practices. Speaking of past questionable practices, Obama essentially declined to prosecute everyone involved in the mistreatment of detainees at Guantanamo, which he promised to close and never did, and other places, arguably establishing a precedent of immunity for serious misconduct. He gave symbolic fines coupled with government bailouts to the executives responsible for the financial crash instead of prosecution, again establishing a precedent of impunity for those crimes. He actively supported Saudi Arabia's military campaign against Yemen, even as Saudi Arabia violated all sorts of international laws by restricting aid, indiscriminate bombing of civilians, etc. He directly pushed for NATO to forcibly overthrow the government of Libya, leaving behind another failed state plagued by civil war, exploitation, etc., as was feared. He expanded deportation and detention of families at the border, which is why people called him the deporter-in-chief. Even with Trump's current approach to deportation, they are so far on pace to fall short of Obama's record numbers. He also doubled the reward offered for Assad Shakur. He signed the indefinite detention law now being used to hold people without charge. Honestly, this list can go on, but nobody reads long comments anyway. Anyone who can't see how all the stuff I mentioned here directly help us get to the situation we're in now, I can't take anything else those people say about politics seriously. Not just what Obama did, but pretty much all of the other administrations. He's just the one people fawn over. People on Reddit still say the biggest scandal he had was wearing a tan suit. Story 35. I find two things can be true at once and that someone can do heroic things while still having a dark history. Take Oskar Schindler for an example. The man was a registered socialist who benefited immensely off the disaster and who got rich using forced labor in his factory. He saved over 1,000 lives, which is undeniably good, but he also did some incredibly bad things, and it could be argued that his position wouldn't have even come about if he hadn't profiteered off of the initial stages of the Holocaust to begin with. He saw the evil that his party was causing and chose to act to save lives, but it doesn't erase the bad parts of his history too. He was, in short, incredibly complex and very human. Story 36. As others have pointed out in these comments, our expectations of heroes are perhaps too high. Human beings are not perfect. They can both have good and bad characteristics. Perhaps a better question would be, did the good they do outweigh the bad? Also, what was the motivation for the things they did that we consider bad? Another thing to consider is, were the bad things that they did considered bad at that time? Times change, morals change. A person's actions need to be looked at within the context of the standards and beliefs of the times. If someone did something bad as a child because they didn't know any better, do we still hold it against them when they become an adult? Just as people learn and grow, so does the world and its inhabitants learn and grow. Story 37. If one of your favorite old-school wrestlers passed away due to complications from injuries or pain pill addiction after returning to the ring long after they were considered in their prime, you can thank Hulk Hogan. He busted Jesse Ventura's Wrestlers Union early on, and that has resulted in numerous athletes passing away with little to no savings and at a relatively young age. One can only hope that those who suffered due to these circumstances eventually find justice for their hardships. Story 38. Che Guevara, Batista was horrible, he deserved to be overthrown, but you can't call yourself a freedom fighter or even a real communist and put and support what's essentially another dictator. Not saying Castro was worse than Batista, but he was definitely a dictator, which is by nature against freedom and communism, not to mention the USA LGBT community taking Guevara as a symbol when the guy supported Cuba's government campaign against homosexuality, which included re-education in the form of obligatory working camps. Not to mention, he wanted this same type of government all over Latin America. Story 39. The band Kiss, mainly Gene Simmons, they have been a group known for aggressive business practices for a long time. One of the things that really frustrates me is the wave of cease and desist letters that pour out to any cover band worth their merit covering Kiss songs. They're like Metallica, circa Napster. You can't dress up like them, cover their songs, or anything without them seeking a percentage from you. You would think with a fading yet very recognizable image, you would want as many people out there advertising for you. Kind of like Elvis all over Vegas. The guys could be immortalized through countless generations if they weren't so aggressively protective of their brand. Story 40. Batman. Batman is a privileged character who, instead of using his ungodly amount of money for good, makes a fancy hideout cave with a butler who has never had his own life, as he has to work for the Wayne family. The antagonists weren't actually bad. For example, Dude thought Poison Ivy was evil. She wanted to respect nature and prevent climate change. Mr. Freeze loved his wife, wanted to cure her, and stole diamonds as he couldn't afford it otherwise. Two-Face suffered a severe mental health break after the loss of his partner and a violent attack to his face with acid, and lost his faith in the justice system after being a respectable prosecutor. The Joker, a person born into the system of child protection yet never protected, suffers from a neurological disorder that causes him to laugh uncontrollably and struggles with depression and psychosis. He relies on social services for medication and therapy, but funding cuts jeopardize his treatment. The Riddler, a smart person who is bullied and made fun of with severe traumas, and the only reason he commits crimes is because Batman exists and he wants to be smarter than him and seeks validation. Batman is capitalism framed as the good guy. Story 41. Not a specific person, but the doctors who brought us various medications and medical procedures by having tested and experimented on black people first, usually without anesthesia because at the time they often operated under the false and harmful belief that they had a higher pain tolerance. The reason we know why certain medications and foods have harmful effects on people is because they were initially tested on black people and the effects on them were recorded. I can't help but think about them whenever I hear that voice on medicine commercials quickly talk about all the side effects of whatever medication they're advertising. Even if it's not a medication that was tested back then, it's just the idea of it. Also, a lot of gynecology tools were tested on black women first, designed by a man, obviously. I assume that's why they're so painful sometimes, because they were designed by a man who had limited experience with and understanding of the anatomy he was treating. Story 42. Severus Snape from Harry Potter. Largely because of the movies, many people consider him a hero, romanticize him, and treat him like a victim. But in reality, he's a wretch, a son of a witch who hated everyone. He attacked Harry only because he hated his father, even though he himself was just as much of a bully. Besides, he hated all students who weren't Slytherin. Being a student's Bogart is one of the worst things any teacher can do. He's supposed to teach, and all he does is be a miserable person. Besides that, I've always thought as a Death Eater, he must have been evil for several reasons. He had the dark mark that's only given to the most select of the group, not just anyone. He was Voldemort's right-hand man, not just any Death Eater. That means he had to do evil and horrible things to get to that position. He was above more faithful Death Eaters like Malfoy, the Averys, and the Lestranges. Story 43. Alexander Graham Bell was a huge proponent of the eugenics movement via the First International Eugenics Conference in 1912 and believed deaf people shouldn't marry each other even though he had a deaf mother and wife. He also led the deaf community into a challenging period with the rise of oral education, shunning sign language. This deprived so many deaf people of access to language and education. Remember, hearing aids and cochlear implants didn't exist during this time. This has caused irrevocable harm and an impact still seen to this day. I strongly dislike this person. Story 44. Let's not forget that Henry Ford set up Ford of Europe as an independent business in the 1930s to sell trucks to Germany during the war, while Ford sold trucks and tanks to the US. Profits from Ford of Europe were reportedly handled through Switzerland. This is arguably one of the most questionable examples of wartime profiteering in history. For all the difficult histories associated with companies like VW, Mercedes, Bauer, Siemens, and really every other major German industrial company at the time, at least they were primarily profiting off of one side of the conflict. Story 45. Oddly, not seen here, but Walt Disney. In 1941, his animators went on strike asking for better pay and to unionize with the Cartoonist Guild. He fired most animators, including the creators of legendary characters like Goofy. In 1947, Disney provided testimony to HUAC and claimed many of those involved in the strike were communists. They weren't. This caused damage to their careers. He was also an FBI informant who provided names to the government, not to mention the racism, misogyny, and anti-Semitism, and Snow White was one of Hitler's favorite movies. Story 46. Any fellow Finn who reads this is going to strongly disagree with me and fiercely challenge this view, but Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, he is undeniably the one person we owe our continued existence to as an independent country, potentially even as a people considering what Stalin did to the Ingrian Finns, but what his forces did during the Finnish Civil War would rightfully be characterized as war crimes and crimes against humanity of the worst kind. It is important to note that both the White Guard and the Red Guard were committing similar acts. Still, the summary executions of thousands of captured prisoners of war, civilians, and suspected enemies was definitely, undeniably wrong. And that was just the White Guard led by Mannerheim. We know the number because they kept meticulous records. We also know that the Red Guard was doing the same, but they didn't keep as many records. Their estimated executions were still in the thousands, too. By today's standards, what Mannerheim and his forces did during the Civil War would have him branded as a war criminal of the highest order. Still, he is the reason we still exist as an independent country. He was quite literally the most instrumental person to the Finnish war efforts during the Winter War and Continuation War, so he is widely considered a hero. And if any of these stories got to you too, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video.